So my name is Jason Hill, and I'm a quantitative ecologist with a local nonprofit, Vermont Center for Eco Studies. Just out of curiosity, how many of you all, this is your first time at a Suds and Science event? Right on. And I'm just wondering, how did you hear about Suds and Science? Facebook?
Valley News.
Valley News? Facebook?
Email blast.
Email from us?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Listserv.
Subscribe to the list somehow.
Somehow.
To the community listserv?
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, to our listserv?
Yeah, you're.
Oh, yeah, that thing with, yeah, we were saying.
Friends of ours and all.
What's that? Friends in the know? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I'm trying to figure out ways to expand our reach. If any of you have any ideas of ways you communicate in our Upper Valley and forums that you haven't seen Suds and Science advertised, I'd love to hear about those, and I'd love to be able to extend our reach to an even broader audience.
Are you on the Upper Valley Facebook page?
Upper Valley Facebook, you got to share with them and have them accept your share. Yeah, but I'm with them. So as I said, I'm a quantitative ecologist here, and we're Vermont Center for Eco Studies. We're a local nonprofit in White River Junction, and for those of you who I recognize and are financial supporters, thank you. So Suds and Science is just that. It is about suds and some science in whatever order you want, whatever your emphasis is on. And it's an opportunity for you to interact with people who are experts in their fields in a casual environment while you enjoy a beer here at a local brew club. Pretty awesome, I think. If you like that and you want to support that, then check out our website. We do a tremendous amount of research and citizen science activities. Check us out. So, who here has ever been to a bog? In Ireland or Finland? A bog. Right, so the bog is an old Irish word, and I used to live in Cork, Ireland, and it's an old Irish word, and it just means soft. And a bog is probably what you're thinking. It's 95% water. It's a low oxygen environment. It's acidic, and whatever you put in there tends to stay in that preserved, mummified form for thousands of years. And humans have been putting things into bogs for thousands of years. Some of you have probably seen images of bogmen, perfectly preserved human beings that are as old as 4,000 years old that they've taken out of these bogs. They have their hair, their skin, they're perfectly intact because of the acidic, low oxygen environment. But people also put things like 100-pound chunks of butter into the bogs, wrap them in deer skin, and maybe their intention is to, get them out later for a big meal. 100 pounds of butter is a lot of big meal. Or maybe it's some, offering to some long-forgotten deity or something. It's not just people thousands of years ago that have been sticking stuff in the bogs. My good friend Marshall McDaniel, Iowa State, put something else in them now. He puts his underwear in them. And I don't know, you want to know how scientists we think of as often people who are difficult to relate to, and where do they come up with these ideas? Well, Marshall puts his underwear in these bogs and soils to figure out how quickly the microbial activity breaks down the cotton in these Fruit of the Loom tighty-whities that he puts out there with various types of fruit and meat and things inside the underwear and buries them in the soil. Now, you're probably thinking, what kind of weirdo comes up with ideas like that? What kind of soil-minded person might be interested in sticking underwear and weird things into the ground? Well, we're going to hear from someone about that tonight. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Caitlin Hicks-Freeze.
Now that was an introduction. I have to say I haven't put underwear in the soil, but I have put popsicle sticks and tea bags, coffee filters, so maybe underwear will be next. So yes, I am a terrestrial ecosystem ecologist, but I focus on soils. And I focused on how terrestrial ecosystems, so land-based ecosystems, grasslands, forests, tundra, bogs, respond to climate change. And I recently moved here and started as a professor at Dartmouth in July, so I'm brand new to the Upper Valley. Before I was in California, lovely California. So it's been a bit of a change, weather-wise, for sure. And before that, I was in Florida, where I did my PhD research. Well, I did my schooling, but I did my research in Alaska. So I had a long commute every summer. Yeah, so that's what I've been doing, and I'm here to talk to you today about why we should be concerned about soils and climate change. So, I also want to say if you have questions during my talk, feel free to like raise your hand, ask a question. I love questions while I'm talking. Do not save them until the end. So we all live in the Upper Valley, and I've only had part of a summer here, but I know thunderstorms are common and the power is spotty. So let's say you're on vacation, the power goes out for a couple days, you come back home to your fridge, okay? You know the power's been out, you gotta deal with it. You open up the fridge, you gotta triage your food. So what's gone bad? Okay, the lettuce, done. Milk, out. All right, that cheddar cheese, maybe. The jar of pickles, okay. The beer in cans, yeah, that's fine, all right? Freezer, what about the freezer? That, total loss. Total loss, you gotta throw everything out. The meats, it's like, who knows how long it was warm and like it thawed and got soft and then it's just, you're done. So the reason why I bring up the fridge is your fridge is filled with organic matter. It's filled with organic carbon, that's our food. And just like your fridge, soils have a lot of organic matter and carbon inside them. And why do you put your food in the fridge?
Preserve it.
To preserve it from what?
Bacterial action.
Yes, you want to preserve it from microbes. And so you put it in the fridge because it slows microbial activity. And so they won't decompose your food. So in the soils, there's food for microbes. So what do we have in the soils that microbes eat? We got leaf litter, dead roots, we got dead microbes themselves, things that have sort of leached down through the litter layer into the soils. So that's all organic carbon. Maybe we wouldn't eat it, but the microbes see that as food just like they see your food in the fridge. So just as food in your fridge, if your fridge dies and it's not warm, it's not cold anymore, decomposition increases. And then your food starts to rot faster. So just with our soils, there's always some decomposition going on, but with global warming and climate change, as it gets warmer, that decomposition process is going to happen faster, and more of that organic carbon is going to get eaten by microbes and respired as CO2 into the atmosphere. So that's why we're concerned. Now, not all organic carbon in the soil is equal in terms of how vulnerable it is to being eaten by microbes and decomposed into CO2. Just like in your fridge, some of it is chemically protected, like those pickles or that hard cheese, so that it's in a form that the microbes don't like or it's hard for them to get to. So that decomposes more slowly. Some of it is physically protected. So if you dug your soil up, you'll see it's like forms these little balls often, what we call soil aggregates. And so sometimes organic carbon can get protected in there because the microbes actually can't get to it. There's these really tiny micropores that even microbes can't get to. So it's physically protected, sort of like something in a jar that's unopened or your unopened can of beer. There's a physical protection. And then sometimes organic carbon is protected by climate. So like your freezer where it's frozen, and so there's very, very, very low rates of microbial activity. There can still be some, but very low rates. And so the permafrost soils in the Arctic are like the food in your freezer, where they're protected from decomposition by dint of being frozen. So the soils around here, they have this physical protection, there's some chemical protection that keeps all of it from being decomposed easily. But in the Arctic, a lot of it is really yummy labile stuff. We say labile, it means just like easy. The microbes want to eat it. It's like candy for microbes. So it's like the milk in your fridge or the lettuce that will decompose really fast. It's like that. And so the only thing preventing the microbes from getting it is the fact that it's frozen. And so I study soils both in the Arctic and in temperate areas like here to look at, as the climate's warming, how much of that carbon is going to go to the atmosphere. And soils store a lot of carbon. So in our atmosphere, we have 800 petagrams of carbon, which is a huge number. It's 10 to the 15th. So 800 times 10 to the 15th. It's equivalent to, 460,000 pyramids or 2,747 jets. So that's in our atmosphere, that much carbon. And then soils store about 33,000. So 800 in the atmosphere, soils store 3,000 petagrams of carbon. And that estimate, I've been studying this for over a decade, 12 years now. That estimate was about 1,600 when I started studying it, and then it went up to 2,400, and now it's at 3,000, so like 3,000. So it keeps going up. And about half of that carbon, over half of it, is stored in permafrost soils in the Arctic, or also on the Tibetan Plateau. Yeah, so a lot of that is in the Arctic. So we're concerned about that. And I actually brought a permafrost soil, kind of, to share with you today. So one thing, okay, I made this permafrost soil. It's very cold. I'm going to pass it around. But one thing that the permafrost soils get a lot, or started to thaw, they get a lot of coverage in the news. So what's one thing you've heard maybe about permafrost soils in the news, and like what types of problems it creates? What have people heard?
Methane release.
Methane release as it warms, for sure.
Ancient viruses.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, the ancient viruses, and then there's anthrax in old dead caribou in Siberia. So that's pretty scary. Maybe not as scary as that is you hear that there's like sinkholes. Sinkholes forming, roads collapsing, houses falling into sinkholes. And so why does permafrost thaw cause that? Well, in areas where you have ice-rich permafrost, there's literally like, we call them ice lenses. This, we'll see, has an ice lens in the middle. So we have soil, and as it freezes, the water sort of attracts itself and creates an ice lens within the soil. So this is a small one. When I cored permafrost soils, you would often find many of these ice lenses. In some areas, you can get gigantic ice lenses. I've stood next to one that was like 3 times the size of this fireplace. So you can imagine when this thaws, it leaves a huge void, and then the ground collapses. And so that's what we call a thermokarst. So that's something that is like oftentimes gets a lot of news because it's a pretty dramatic effect of climate change. You can see it happening. And it's something that
Is an ice lens filled with ice when it's frozen?
it's literally just water. Yeah, it's just water. And then the soil will be around it. So I'll pass this around. Watch out, it's quite cold. But that, it looks a lot like when I would drill or auger into permafrost soils, that's what I would see, many of those ice lenses. And how, you might wonder, do you sample permafrost soils? Well, you basically use like a gas-powered, I guess people use it for ice fishing, having never gone ice fishing, but it's like this gasoline-powered auger. We had the auger made special by John's Machine Shop in Fairbanks. They specialize in permafrost drills. Very, very specialized company. Great place to go to. And you have these carbide bits on the bottom, so it actually can go through the ice. It's hard. Like, there's 2 people, and you're just like, and you're drilling into the ground. It's quite tough work. But you get a lot of those ice lenses. So that's why when the permafrost thaws in ice-rich areas, you just get these collapse. So, question?
Where exactly is permafrost concentrated in the world?
So most of it is in the northern hemisphere, and it's going to be in Alaska, Canada, Siberia. There's some in Scandinavia, but most of it's in Alaska, Canada, and Russia. And so if anyone's familiar with Alaska, where I did my research was Healy, Alaska, which is really close to Denali National Park. And so that's sort of the area what's called discontinuous permafrost. So there's not permafrost everywhere. There's permafrost there on north-facing slopes. So that's kind of the start of where the permafrost is in Alaska. And then also at like higher elevations, you'd see permafrost farther south. And so people think there might be relic permafrost in the Rockies at really high elevations, but unsure about that. There's definitely permafrost on the Tibetan Plateau because it's so high, but that's generally where it's found. And there's probably a little bit, in Antarctica, but there's not much land mass in those latitudes in the southern hemisphere. So the goal of the research that I did in Alaska was we were really concerned about whether permafrost thaw would cause old carbon to be lost. So in these systems, carbon has been accumulating since basically the end of the Ice Age. Carbon has just been accumulating in these systems because it's so cold. Anytime plants die or they drop their leaves or their roots die or whatever, that wasn't decomposing very fast because it was so cold. So you just started to get this accumulation of organic carbon. And in some ways it was like a peat bog. In some areas where it was wet, you had accumulation of moss. And that was just accumulating, and then it was freezing into the permafrost layer and just not decomposing. So in some areas, this carbon in Alaska was like 10,000 years old. So this is carbon that's been building up for a really long time. And we're concerned about losing that carbon because it's kind of like burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels is organic carbon that's been in the ground for millions and millions of years. When you burn that, it's like been out of sort of the climate system for so long, you can't really make up that with increased plant growth. So if you lose this really old carbon, you can't really get that back into the ground easily. And so we were curious in Alaska about how much old carbon was being lost due to permafrost thaw. And so to do this experimentally, there were areas where we went and we just sort of could say, okay, we've seen a thermokarst here, we know permafrost has thawed, we measured those. But the gold standard is to look at it experimentally. And so we wanted to cause our own permafrost thaw. We wanted to cause it to happen experimentally. And the way we did that was we built snow fences. And so we built these snow fences that were perpendicular to the prevailing wind. The wind would come over these snow fences in the winter, carry snow, slow down, and then drop the snow on the other side. We were really good at making snow fences. So our snow fences caused these like 1.5 meters, so like my height plus this tall, snow drifts that were 10 meters wide and would go back another 6 meters behind the fence. So these massive areas of snow. And this snow, generally in the tundra, the snow would be like 5 to 10 centimeters, so like 2 to 4 inches tall, because it was so windy. Any snow that would fall would just get blown away. But behind these snow fences, we had this massive snowpack. And what that snowpack acted like was this giant down blanket that kept the soils warm throughout the winter. It insulated the soils from the really cold Arctic winter. And it kept them so warm that they sort of retained that warmth throughout the summer, and they were warmer than a control soil that didn't get the snow fence throughout the entire year. And within a couple years, we started to see the permafrost thawing and these thermokarsts forming where we had the snow fence. Now the thing about the snow fence was it caused this giant pile of snow. And so we couldn't just leave it there in the spring because it would delay spring. I mean, it's going to take a long time for this giant pile of snow to melt. It would add water into the experiment, and we just wanted to test the effect of warming. So every April we had to go out there and remove this massive snowpack. And I described the size of one of them, and we had 6 of them. So there'd be a group of 5 of us. Every April, we'd go out there, and the road would be closed. Where we had our experiment, they didn't plow the road. And so sometimes we took snowmobiles, which in Alaska they call snow machines. Very strict about that. If you call it a snowmobile, they know you're not from Alaska. I thought a snow machine was to make snow for ski mountains. Wrong. Or my favorite mode of transportation was dog sled. So where we lived, we were in Alaska, we lived in this cabin, and there'd be like 5 of us researchers in this 2-room cabin, all sleeping in a loft, all sharing a very tiny kitchen, and then every surface was covered in like soils and mason jars filled with soil just everywhere. So we go back to our cabin. Our cabin was next to 30 sled dogs. And in the winter, when we got there, the people who owned the sled dogs let us use them for transportation. So this was like a dream come true of mine, because I adore dogs, and I adore dogs that have jobs. And so we got to take them to the field. And the first time, it was only like a 4-mile trip to get to the field from the cabin. So the first time we took him to the field, well, first of all, when you're about, I don't know if anyone, has anyone gone dog sledding? Yeah. You see how excited they are. Like when you start, they go so fast. And they told me, like, whatever you do, like, don't let go of the sled, because they'll just keep going. And so you have this like grappling hook around a tree, and then you just gotta like take it up, and like they're just gone, because they're like pulling at the sled as soon as they're harnessed in. And so my sled, of course, flipped over because I have no idea what I'm doing. Like, they just let me go on my own. I've never done this before. And I didn't let go. So I was dragged, I don't know, quarter mile or so before they finally slowed down enough where I could right the sled again. So I held on, and the other researchers were like, why didn't you let go? And I was like, because they told me, whatever you do, don't let go. So we got them to the field the first day, and they started to fight. So here we are trying to remove this massive amount of snow, and it's like really packed. I mean, we basically are like taking it out in chunks and putting on a sled and then running the sled away from the experiment, dumping it, coming back. I mean, it was hard work. And the dogs started fighting because they did not get enough exercise. So second day, which was great, we took them on like a 15-mile route over these lakes and through these beautiful woods and across the tundra to tire them out so they would calmly lay down while we worked on the snow. So that was not so much science, but the fun things you get to do as sort of being a scientist, you get to do some fun things on the side. So we removed that snow. So that was April. We then left, and then we'd come back in May. So I would spend the whole summer in Alaska with these 5 other researchers and also with my trusty dog, Dale, not a sled dog. He was from Florida. He's a coon. He actually is still alive, surprisingly. He's a coonhound. So Alaska is not his native habitat. I like to think that the sled dogs, they would always bark very viciously at him, and I think it's because he looks so different. You know, he had these floppy hound ears and this big hound nose, and he didn't look like a sled dog. So I would spend my summers making measurements out on the tundra with my dog Dale. And what kind of measurements did I make? So to see how much CO2 is being released as a result of permafrost thaw, we just measure the CO2. So we use PVC pipe. This is what we call a collar. They're installed in the ground. And then we use this IRGA here. IRGA stands for infrared gas analyzer. So this is on. The current carbon dioxide concentration of this room is 872 parts per million. What is the outside, what would it be? Who knows? 400. About 400. Yeah, so we're all breathing CO2 and it's measuring that. Yeah, room full of hot air. And so we would take an IRGA like this, and it has this chamber, and place it on our collar. And then you'd see the carbon dioxide increasing, and that would just be a measurement of the rate. This one's not really fitting well. The rate of soil release, carbon release from the soil. So pretty simple measurement. That's one of the measurements we would do. But we were also interested in how old the carbon was, right? So we want to know how much more carbon was coming out as a result of permafrost thaw and how old that carbon was. And so we used radiocarbon. So you may have heard of radiocarbon because it's often used to date artifacts. So like the Shroud of Turin, it was disproved using radiocarbon. They did a radiocarbon date of it and found out it was from like the 15th or 16th century and not from zero. It's not from the time of Jesus. So it's oftentimes used in archaeology, but we use it in ecology and soil work as well. And so I would take radiocarbon samples, which I would basically just collect a flask of air that was coming out of the tundra. So I would put a different chamber on top of our collar, collect the flask of air, and then I would bring it back to the lab, which I'll get to in a second. So one time I'm out there, it was August. I would have to go out and sample really early in the morning, like 5 a.m., because I needed a stable boundary layer, also known as no wind. It's hard to come across in the tundra at a time when there's no wind, but generally between 5 a.m. and 10 a.m., it was calm. And it's always light out. I mean, at 5 a.m., the sun is in the middle of the sky. So every morning I'd get up, my dog would give me this stink eye the whole time I was getting my caffeine ready. And sometimes I'd even have to carry him to the truck because he refused to be up and at him so early. But I needed him because I was alone on the tundra making these measurements. And there's a lot of hazards on the tundra, a lot of animals. Oftentimes, until this morning in August, it was people, weird people that I would encounter, because we were 5 miles from the bus where Christopher McCandless died into the wild. You might be familiar with that story. And so there were always pilgrims, just as ill-prepared as he, looking to get out to the bus. And it happened all the time. I mean, like, once every 10 days probably, where some random person would come up to me on the tundra and it was like middle of nowhere and be like, which way to the bus? And they're like, are you going to the bus? And I'm like, no, I'm a scientist. I just stay out here all summer. And have you been to the bus? Well, no, because you have to cross this like really dangerous river. I'm like, did you read the book or see the movie? Like, this isn't a good idea. And I'd be like, well, it's that way. Good luck. So the dog was good for, keeping people like that kind of far from me. And this one morning, though, I'm there and I'm here with my erga, and the one I had made like this really loud buzzing sound. And I'm in a thermocar, so there's this big depression, and I can't really see up above the tundra. And all of a sudden, I hear my dog go, woof, woof. It's really deep bark, and I'm like, oh, it's one of those pilgrims again. And I look up, and it's a grizzly bear. It's a big male grizzly bear. And I'm like, okay. So I got my bear spray. It's on a carabiner on my waist. I'm like, all right, I'm ready. And I took the training at Denali National Park. Like, you're supposed to yell and be big and wave your arms. And I am yelling, and this grizzly bear just keeps coming closer. I estimate it was probably about 30 yards away, too close for comfort. And my dog, hearing my distress or being an idiot, runs to the bear. And at this point, I'd only had him for a year, and he was a hound dog. And so in Alaska, he got into trouble. He treed porcupines. He chased caribou. We got yelled at by natural resources because my dog chased caribou. Like, he would get us into trouble. And I said, oh, you went after, like, my dog is dead. He's just stupid. He's dead, and I'm going to get out of this. So I start backing away slowly, and I actually then fall into another thermokarst. So now I'm like up to my thighs in water, and I'm looking at what's happening to my dog. And he runs up to the bear and gets really close to it, but then like draws a line and stands there and then runs up and down along this line, basically saying to the bear, like barking at it, like, don't cross this, like don't get near her. And so he knew, like, his hound dog instincts. He didn't chase it for prey like he did the moose and the caribou and the porcupine. Like, he knew this was something else. And he got it to turn around. And then he came running back to me, and twice more the bear came after us. And twice more my dog ran up to it and like drew that imaginary line that you can't cross and got him to turn around. And the third time, when the bear turned around, my dog Dale chased him off. So then we had another 15-minute walk back to the truck. And I just left my very expensive equipment in the thermokarst. I wasn't going back for it. And I went and I got it was like 8 a.m. I went and got the other researchers up, and I was like, someone's going to come out. Like, I'm not going out there alone the rest of the time. Like, I had another month there, and I refused to go alone. And that bear, it had been seen a couple of times before. And my dog became locally famous after that. So word of mouth got out that my dog had like protected me from a grizzly bear, and like everywhere we went in town, people would be like, oh, is that Dale? Like, for years afterwards. So yeah, that was just some of the risks of doing research in Alaska. But there were many rewards. We could see Denali, the mountain, on clear days from our field sites. And the alpenglow in the evenings in September off the Alaska range was gorgeous. So it was a really fun time. But what did we find scientifically? So we actually found that as a result of the permafrost thaw that we had caused experimentally, that we had doubled the amount of old carbon being lost from the soil. And so we also found, however, that while we were doubling the amount of old carbon, we were also increasing the amount of plant-respired carbon. So plants, they take up carbon in photosynthesis, which is good. They're a carbon sink. They take up CO2, they turn it into organic carbon, that's good. And they use some of that organic carbon to do their own metabolic processes, and they breathe out CO2 just like we do. So with this permafrost thaw, we saw an increase of old carbon loss and an increase in plant respiration as a result of the plants grew better. So the plants grew better as a result of permafrost thaw. As the organic matter decomposed, it released nutrients. They liked the warmer soils. They grew faster. So that was some good news. So the old carbon losses during the summer were matched by the carbon gains in plants. However, long term, like during the winter, in Alaska, there's a long, cold winter. It's 8 months long. The plants aren't growing at all. And the way the soil freezes is it freezes from the top. And it actually takes a long time for that freeze front to get all the way to the bottom. So there's this unfrozen soil that can last into December. And that unfrozen soil is that old carbon that we're worried about. So over the course of a year, we were still losing old carbon and not having it gained by plant growth. So that's what we found there. So when people talk about the permafrost thaw climate change feedback, where permafrost is thawing, organic carbon is being released as CO2, it's a positive feedback to climate change because climate change is caused by CO2. They're worried about this old carbon loss. They're worried about the loss of all this carbon in the soil. And recently, some models have shown that it's actually not going to be until 2100 where we really see the effects of this, which is good news and bad, because people are having trouble making decisions about what to do about climate change. So delayed consequences can be a problem. But the good news is, and the reason why it's delayed till 2100 is the plants are growing better, and that's going to compensate at least until 2100. And then the soil losses will take over. And one of the reasons is we talked about how much carbon is in the soil. So within like 1 meter square of tundra, there's like 70 kilograms of carbon per meter squared. That's equivalent to 30 sacks of King Arthur flour. And in terms of plants, there's half a kilogram. So 70 versus half. So even if those plants became a huge, like maybe not a huge forest, but a spruce forest, like you would get in the boreal forest, that's still only about 5 kilograms of carbon per square meter in plants. So the soils have a lot more to lose than the plants have to gain. But we won't see that effect until 2100, which means we actually have a chance to mitigate this. If we can cut our emissions and reduce them in the next 20 to 30 years, we might be able to stave off the worst of our permafrost carbon consequences.
How about the methane component?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So in these soils that I'm talking about, they were not super wet. I mean, they were pretty wet, but there was a section on top that would dry out. And so methane would be released by the microbes deep in the soil. But then there are these, in the aerobic areas where there's oxygen, there's other microbes called methanotrophs that actually consume methane as food. And so in these soils, we had the methanotrophs working for us, and they were taking up the methane before it got into the atmosphere. But that's not the case everywhere. In some areas where you have really wet, where you have thermokarst and it causes like a lake to form, there are increases in methane. So that is definitely a concern, and methane is a stronger but shorter-lived greenhouse gas than CO2. And this model that I was telling you about, these model predictions, were taking methane into account. But yes, it's a concern. In the particular site where I was, not as much of a concern. So, yes?
Just to follow up on that, if the freeze is occurring from the top down, the methane release is going to continue longer than the methanotrophs are active and consumed.
Great question. Yes, we would see methane burps in the spring. So in the spring, you would see a methane burp. So if you had, like, we have these towers that can measure CO2 from like a large area, CO2 and methane that's being released from a large area, the balance over like maybe a kilometer of tundra. And you would see in May, as the soils thawed out, a release of methane. You would also see in that burp, there would also be a lot of old carbon being released as a result of what was decomposed while it was, waiting to freeze up, and then wasn't released till it had thawed. So there would be.
How old is old carbon?
Great question. So the oldest at our site was 10,000 years old. So it started accumulating at the start of the Holocene epoch. And with the stuff I was measuring from the top, the oldest I think I saw was like 200 years old, but that's because there's a lot of new carbon that sort of dilutes it. So we would actually use mathematical models to figure out how much old carbon was contributing to the 200-year-old carbon, because it was a mixture of new and old. Yeah.
Did you see any kind of positive feedback of the exposed brown surface of the soil? Was that starting to absorb more sunlight and warm up, and did that accelerate the CO2 release?
So I did not look at that. There are people who look at the energy balance. It's called the energy balance, and like the albedo change. So at our site, even when the thermokarst, like even when it sort of, we had the thermokarst forming, it wouldn't really show the soil. There'd be moss on top and plants still. But in some areas, I don't think the difference between like brown soil and the tundra vegetation is a lot in terms of the reflectance. It's not like the difference between snow and water and vegetation. It's pretty small difference. Yeah.
You said 2100 is where you think this is. Does that correspond to a temperature increase in the Earth, or?
Like a phase change, like the phase change from frozen to unfrozen.
Is that what we're talking about? Or?
I mean, so that's like what causes a permafrost thaw, and that's going to happen at a different time depending on like where it is. I think that's just the point at which so much of the soil is unfrozen that it overwhelms the plant response. So it's just like the sheer volume of what's unfrozen at that point. Yeah.
So are all of your study sites around here just chosen to contrast, compare and contrast with your Arctic sites, or why did you choose the local sites?
All right, yeah, so I haven't talked about local sites at all. So Arctic is like a big, sexy story because there's so much carbon there. But I've also worked in California, and I'm starting work here where, so instead of 30 sacks of King Arthur flour, there's 8 sacks of King Arthur flour worth of carbon. And so it's not as much as stored in permafrost soils, and it's not drastic where you have a phase change from frozen to unfrozen, but we're still seeing an increase in CO2, and it can be a lot because soils like the ones around here, I mean, they cover the majority of the earth, right? It's a larger area. And so if 1,500 petagrams are from permafrost, we still have 1,500 petagrams that are from regular soils. And so I also look at how temperate soils in forests like around here and in forests in California and in grasslands, how they're responding to warming as well. And so in California, what I saw, we did a soil warming experiment there. We didn't have snow, so we actually had to we pounded in rods into the soil and then put heating cables down like you use to keep your pipes freezing in the winter. We had 22 of those around a 3-meter plot, and we had 6 of these plots. And what we found was if we increased temperatures there by just 4 degrees Celsius, which is what is predicted by 2100 in a business as usual, no mitigation scenario, we increased the carbon losses by 35%. So not as drastic but it's still an increase that we would be concerned about. And so that was in California. And I'm also looking around here. So one of the things I did in California was we wanted to know how deep soils respond. There's been warming experiments in temperate soils before, but a lot of them just sort of focus on the surface soil because, frankly, it's a pain in the ass to go deeper. Like, it's a lot more work. It's just a lot more elbow grease. You got to put all your sensors down deep. You're digging these large holes, and if you're just looking at the top 20 centimeters, it's like you're gardening. It's different. And a lot of people originally thought, oh, we don't have to worry about deep soils because there's not as much carbon there in terms of a percent, right? So a permafrost soil is like 45% carbon in like a peat bog. The top soil here is like 8% carbon. And deeper down, maybe it's only 1 or 2% carbon. But again, it's a volume issue. There's a lot of deep soil carbon, and people originally thought it wouldn't respond to warming. For a myriad of reasons. They thought it was more chemically and physically protected. But what I showed in California was the deep soils respond just like the surface soils. So it's sort of more to worry about. And to look at regular soils, I just had a couple to show. These are from Moose Mountain. There's a 0 to 10 centimeters and then a 10 to 20. And you can look at the color difference. The darker one has more organic carbon. So that's a good way to see how much carbon your soils have. Just use color. It's a little hard in the low light here, but there is a slight color difference. Is there a question? I saw someone, no? Yes.
Trying to get.
Sorry.
Are you doing work in forests, and if so, are you doing any deep soil analysis in forests? Because I understand in old growth that there's a lot more carbon being stored deep than they ever thought there was.
So I haven't done that. That might be a good question. I'm still trying to pick out which questions to pursue here in New England. So that would be one I would be interested in looking into for sure. I have to say I'm a bit skittish about deep soils in New England because rocks, and lots of them. In California, I was in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, and we had like just these gorgeous soils that were just, you know, they had these beautiful horizons, like these different colors, and they went down like 1.5 meters before you hit a rock. I mean, I was really spoiled. So yeah, I'm still trying to figure out.
The roots that are in the rocks.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's a different place. So I'm still trying to figure out here because the amount of infrastructure you need for one of these soil warming experiments and how much you have to install is a lot, and so rocks could really kind of ruin it without needing to have something that could drill through rocks, which then means you can't really be in a forest because you have to bring in some heavy equipment. So I'm thinking about how to do this. It might have to be on a smaller scale. I mean, one thing that people do a lot of is mason jar science with soils, where instead of going out into and doing these in situ like experiments like in the tundra or forest like I've done, they just sort of take the soils and put them in jars and then put them in incubators at different temperatures. And they use these valves here, and you can measure the CO2 out of this and put it into the erga and get an idea of soil responses. But that's really not ideal because you're taking the soil out of its environment, you're taking it away from the roots and other like carbon inputs that it gets, you know, every year. So that's an option, but not a great one. One thing I'm thinking about doing is perhaps setting up a deep soil warming experiment at the Dartmouth Organic Farm. It's not a forest, but it's a lovely floodplain with soils like butter that I can easily put all this equipment in. And what would be really interesting there is that that's a very degraded soil. So this soil has been in agriculture. It's an old field, so a very common New England type ecosystem where it's been in agriculture and it's been mowed for many years. And so it's actually degraded. It's lost like half of the organic carbon that it should have. And so an interesting experiment to do there would be to warm the soils and look at the interaction between trying to add amendments to get that organic carbon back in those soils and whether you can do that with warming. So whether you're able to do that. And that's a pretty popular thing right now because of the 4 per mil initiative. So at the Paris climate talks, a group of soil scientists, one that I know very well from France, got together and said if we could increase soil carbon by 4 1,000ths every year, that you could help mitigate the emissions going into the atmosphere. Now this is super pie in the sky stuff. Like that's never going to happen on a large scale. So it can't solve our problems, but it could be part of the solution if we also reduce our emissions and mitigate in other ways. So it could be part of a balanced solution. But no one's really looked at trying to add amendments to soils to increase organic carbon in a warmer world, which is what we'd be trying to do. So I'm thinking maybe testing that locally. The other thing is there's 2 existing warming experiments already. There's one at Hubbard Brook, another one which is an hour away in New Hampshire, and another one in Harvard Forest. A really famous one is in Harvard Forest. It's been going on for 20 years. And so I have put equipment out there to look at the deep soil response from those warming experiments because again, they really focused on the surface and they're actually not even sure how deep they're warming the soil. So I've gone out there and installed gas wells. This is like a long metal straw that I insert into the soil, and usually there's a septa on here. And I can take samples and see what the carbon dioxide concentrations within the soil profile are, and then model what the CO2 losses are from each depth. So I am working in a couple existing soil warming experiments right now, locally. But yeah, I'm definitely like up for ideas because I'm new to the area and seeing, and so I've taken some samples from local forests. These are Moose Mountain samples, and also from the Dartmouth Organic Farm, and I'm looking for sites and questions. So
So this is all about temperature increases, but if the temperature was stable and you had an old growth forest that, I don't know, 1,000 years old or something, is the ground accumulating more carbon in this area?
So that's a really interesting question. So generally we think as a forest grows and as we have succession occurring, there is an accumulation of carbon, but over time it is going to reach an equilibrium, likely, where it's not just going to like keep accumulating carbon. You don't have, it's not like a peat bog or like the certain tundras where you just really get like sort of a vertical accumulation of carbon.
And that happens in the soil as well as on the surface?
So on the in the peat bog?
In a forest.
Oh, in the forest, yeah, so some of it's going to start so as the forest grows, some of it's going to start accumulating at depth from the roots dying off down there, and then you will have the litter layer building up. But the litter layer will reach like a steady state, so it doesn't just keep getting larger. And eventually it's in balance where the carbon inputs from plants equal the outputs from decomposition. So it would reach a balance. But the balance it reaches in an old growth forest, it has a lot more carbon than once you've cut it down and used to have these younger forests. And one thing with logging around here is they looked at the effects on the surface soil. Again, there's been a lot of work on surface soil and less so on deep soil. And they say, okay, after logging, it loses carbon for 20 to 50 years, and then it starts gaining carbon again. But things are delayed in the deep soil. So after logging, even 80 to 100 years later, it's still losing carbon from deep soil, even as it recovers in surface soil.
What is the mechanism that makes carbon release from the soil when at least methane is heavier than air, so you would want to stay down where it is?
I mean, it's just a diffusion gradient. So, I mean, carbon dioxide is also heavier than air, but when you have a lot of it, it's still going to diffuse to where it's at a lower concentration. So this moves, it still can move along the diffusion gradient.
That's seeking equilibrium between?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And isn't true carbon actually the dead bodies of microbes, like the ancient carbon?
So it depends. It depends on where you are. So the oldest carbon in, say, a forest soil is likely the dead bodies of microbes because that carbon isn't, again, we have the climate conditions so much that a lot of the microbes can eat the organic carbon that comes from the plants, and then it kind of cycles through the microbes a bit, and then it gets stuck onto minerals. And once it's stuck to a mineral, the microbes can't access it anymore, and that's where the old carbon builds up in a forest soil. But say in the tundra or in a bog, plant inputs can just come and become old carbon over time because it's either too wet or too cold for the microbes to eat it. So it depends on where you are.
So would stimulating microbial life cycles actually sequester carbon in the soil?
That's a thought, and some people are testing it now. And there's a relatively new theory that the most labile, so the yummiest, most candy-like forms of carbon in leaf litter is the carbon that gets stored for the longest because it goes through the microbes and then gets stuck onto minerals. Because in order to be stuck onto a minerals, you have to be like a smaller molecule, like a sugar or lipid or protein. You can't be one of the more complex molecules like lignin or cellulose that's from a plant, like from the direct plant litter. So that's a relatively new theory, past 5 years or so, and it's being tested. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm trying to think if I have anything else for you guys. I think I might not, but I'm happy to answer more questions.
Any thoughts about, the theory that organisms, ancient or viruses are going to be released? Any?
I mean, yeah, so that's not really my specialty, but
You might have friends.
so I will say that organisms stuck in permafrost show surprising ability to start growing again once they're unfrozen. So there's cases where moss that's been frozen in permafrost, once unfrozen and exposed to light, starts growing again. And so that's a lot more complex organism than a virus. So for sure, I mean, the microbes, they're there. Once they're unfrozen, they start working. And viruses are more simple than that. So definitely a possibility.
And as some people are looking at sequestering carbon through better soil management practices on agricultural soils. Have you done any work on that?
So that's, I'm looking into that now, potentially with the organic farm. Yeah, it's definitely possible. So the idea of no-till, just and leaving residues on the surface. So like just as a homeowner, don't bag your grass clippings, leave them on the surface. That's going to increase the organic carbon in your lawn. So there are practices you can do. The problem with agriculture is because there's a lot of nitrogen additions, adding nitrogen can help increase organic carbon, but if you add too much, you then get nitrous oxide release, N2O, or yeah, you get N2O release, which is a greenhouse, very powerful greenhouse gas. So with the ag stuff, it seems like it's a really fine line to get the balance right in terms of all the greenhouse gases. But deeper rooting plants, less till, those are some ways. And there's people looking at getting deeper rooting plants to help increase carbon. Yeah.
In your probing around here and digging, have you encountered some of the subsoils that are reddish brown? They're called spodic horizons.
Oh, spodic, yes.
This is technical stuff, but they have been accumulating carbon for 10,000 years. And it's only when they're disturbed that suddenly they can disappear.
They can just suddenly, I didn't know that they could suddenly disappear. I mean,
the old potato farmers in this valley, the early ones that in the colonial times would plow these soils up, forest soils. They had these wonderful spodic horizons with 8% carbon in them. And in a few decades, the carbon was lost. They weren't spodic horizons anymore. They were soils like at the organic farm. So it's a very vulnerable kind of carbon.
Yeah, so the spodic horizons it forms it, so that's like a lot of soils around here are not quite old enough to be a spodic horizon, but they're to be a spodosol. They're inceptisols, but they're on their way to being spodosols, and that's where you have these really acidic plant inputs. So from lots of organic matter, like in the leaf litter, it's really acidic, and as it goes through the soil, it basically takes the organic carbon and minerals, and then it accumulates in one spot, and that's the spodic horizon, where you get this accumulation of minerals and organic carbon. And a lot of the organic carbon is protected by minerals. And I don't know what the exact mechanism of why when it's tilled, it would be lost. But one thing I would say would probably be once you separate it from the forest ecosystem, you probably have a change in pH. And that would be enough to release the organic carbon from the minerals, and then it's available for decomposition.
Well, they also the farmers began to lime the soil.
Yeah, so that would cause a lot of it to be lost.
Just what you said, you take this acidic soil that naturally accumulates carbon, and the lime helps the microbes and breaks down what you told, the mineral organic bonding. And
yeah,
so liming is good for some things, and for climate change, it may not be such a.
And interestingly enough, as our soils here have recovered from the effects of acid rain, we've seen increased dissolved organic carbon losses to streams and lakes. And I think that's because as the soils are recovering, the pH is increasing, and then we're losing the mineral absorption, and that organic carbon is either being, I don't know if you could see like in a soil respiration measurement like I do, but they've definitely seen it in measurements in lakes and streams. So. Yeah, the pH stuff I think is super interesting.
Do you think that's part of the blue-green algae bloom in Lake Champlain?
Yes, I do. Because some of the blue-green, some of those algal blooms you're seeing, normally you see them in a catchment where you expect it to happen because there's a dairy farm right there, and there's just a ton of phosphorus and nitrogen running into that lake. And now they're seeing these algal blooms in forested areas. where usually there hasn't been algal blooms and there's not an obvious source of nutrients. And so that is a definite potential reason for algal blooms. Yeah. And there's people at Dartmouth looking into that. Yeah, unintended consequences of fixing environmental problems. It's just, once things get out of whack, you just don't know. Yeah.
I don't know if you looked at the numbers, but my understanding is that agriculture and especially plowed agriculture, kind of modern agriculture in the United States, has actually put an enormous amount of carbon in the atmosphere, maybe as much as all fossil fuel burning.
Not as much as, I don't think we'd say as much as all fossil fuel burning from the United States. So I might get the number wrong, but there's a really good paper that just came out in September where they estimated the amount of carbon that has been lost from soils as a result of modern agriculture, like in the past 2,000 years. I think the number was 160 petagrams. It was a lot. I can get you yeah, okay, yeah, it says Sanderman et al. I'm not sure the exact number, but it was over 100 petagrams. But that's like worldwide. So
What's the release from fossil fuel burning?
trying to remember. It's definitely higher because it's about, right now it's at about 10 petagrams a year.
Oh my.
But half of it's like going into the oceans or going into plants. So we only, like, out of all the fossil fuels we're putting into the atmosphere, we're only seeing the effect of half of it, thanks to our oceans and plants. Yeah. Which is why, I mean, so I heard, no, it's not good for the oceans at all. Like the pH of the oceans has dropped substantially as a result of this. Yeah. So, any other questions? Yes.
What role for the citizen scientists do you see in your work? What could the layperson do to either assist or get out of the way, whichever is more helpful?
So I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, and I'm trying to think of ways. You know, there's a great grad student at Dartmouth right now, Morgan Peach, who he might have measured in some of your, like he was actually going around to different people's lawns and measuring how much carbon was in their lawns. But I'm trying to think if there's a way that we could do like a monitoring program where you could see like how much carbon's in your lawn versus in maybe you have a meadow or an old field, or maybe you have forest, and sort of helping you manage the carbon on your own property. So I've been thinking that, like, could you send samples into my lab and we could just get an idea of how much you have? Maybe you want to change, you're like, okay, this is lawn, I don't need it to be lawn, let me put it as meadow. You should probably see a carbon increase if you did something like that over, you know, it's going to take time. You're going to see that increase probably over 5 to 10 years.
I ask because I design and maintain gardens all
Oh,
over
yeah.
the valley, and so convincing clients to do one thing versus another is often helpful to have, gee, this is why we have to make it a meadow, and you really don't need that lawn anymore. And that's just at the surface, let alone what maybe down
Right.
below, but I'm just wondering if there's...
But at the surface, I mean, generally around here, it depends on the ecosystem, right? But here in this ecosystem, you're going to have more carbon in this area. You're going to have more carbon in a forest than you do in a meadow, and more carbon in a meadow than you do in a lawn. Mm-hmm. Just because of the amount of plant inputs you're having.
More carbon per acre or more carbon in the soil?
More carbon in the soil. Now the plant but also in plants. So in the soil and also in the plant carbon. They go hand in hand here in this area. Now there's some areas of the country, like where I was in California, where lawns are problematic for other reasons, water. But you would have more carbon in a lawn than you would in the native ecosystem because you're watering the lawn and you're increasing the productivity. You're increasing the amount of carbon being fixed by plants that then goes into the soil. Yeah, so it depends on where you are. I mean, and how you want to. But here, I think it's easy, and it's good in many ways to manage for more carbon. You just need to keep more of your property in sort of its natural state. But you can garden it and make it pretty too. You can have different shrubs, and there's options. But lawn is not your best option. I mean, in my own, like we only have 1.5 acres, but a lot of it's in meadow. And so I've been thinking, how do I want to keep it as meadow, like an old field, or do I want to let it go back to forest? And I'm thinking in terms of carbon. I'm also thinking in terms of wildlife and insects, and I'm still weighing all the pros and cons in my head. So.
Is there an easy way to, with, checking the emissions from the soil, to figure out how much carbon there is in the soil? Or is there...
The easiest way is that we would come take a sample and grind it up, and then you combust it on an elemental analyzer, and you can look at the CO2 that comes off when you burn it. That's the easiest way. So, yeah, that's how we would do it.
Soil sample, you dry it, and then weigh it, and then put it in the oven and put it at 500 degrees for a couple of hours and burn off all the carbon and weigh it again.
And you assume half the mass loss is carbon that way. That's the loss on ignition. And the way we do it, we actually can measure exactly how much carbon comes off. Oh, like you've actually done this at your house? I don't think my oven could. That's great. I don't think my oven could get up to 500, though. I must say, in Alaska, I did have to dry soils out, and all I had was an oven. Yeah. So I kept that. I tried to keep that oven at like 160 degrees Fahrenheit, but I did burn my soils. That was bad. Home oven. I love it. Love it.
So the two samples you have for Moose Mountain, one is from a hemlock, one is pine.
Oh, I'm sorry. I split them up. There's also pine and hemlock here.
I was gonna ask, are you
It's a
studying
matched pair.
those for a particular reason?
Yeah, so what I've done at Moose Mountain and Balch Hill and some other places is I'm interested in seeing the effects of tree species on the amount of organic carbon to see whether there's tree species effects. And I'm particularly interested in hemlock because we're about to lose them. And they generally have stored a lot of organic carbon because they have really acidic litter and these very thick O horizons. And so I'm interested in whether we have these sort of systematic effects of tree species on organic carbon and what that's going to mean in the future as the tree species composition of this area changes as a result of invasives and also as a result of climate change.
Our hemlocks don't make up a very large percentage of our softwood population.
No.
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 So.
But I'm also looking. So I'm looking right now. I've just chose hemlock, pine, and deciduous, mostly maple, just to look at.
So white pine, as a filling in open spaces, does it really fast.
Yes.
And so you must get a lot of carbon sequestration early in that.
Yeah, I haven't looked at like successional age with this. I just went out in October and got some samples in 3 different forests under pine and hemlock and deciduous. And the forests themselves are about equal age, the different species types, just to see if I can see some differences. So I'm looking at total carbon, and I'm looking at the amount of it that's associated with minerals. And then I'm also looking at the amount, like kind of the types of metals that they have, because that's dependent upon pH. And the tree species can have an effect on pH. And the metals are important because they absorb to the organic carbon and prevent the microbes from getting to it. But it's really just very preliminary stuff. I mean, it was just like a test and to help get my lab up and running and all of our different procedures ready. So.
Another challenge. Are you looking at mycelium?
Not at the moment, but I'm writing a grant to. Okay. Yeah.
Because that's kind of, in my way of thinking, that's the magic that makes soils work.
I mean, they're super important, especially in forests. And then there's a lot of talk now that whether you have sort of arbuscular mycorrhizal trees like maples or ectomycorrhizal trees like oaks and pines and hemlocks could have really big consequences for soil carbon. So I'm writing a grant to look at that. We'll see.
Could you expand on that a little bit? What's the difference?
I have to come for another talk. I would have to come for another talk.
Okay.
But it's how the mycorrhizal fungi get nutrients for the tree. And how they do it can change the soil carbon, perhaps. These are hypotheses currently being tested. Yeah.
If you go to TED Talks and you put in mushrooms will save the world, you'll get Paul Stamets' 18-minute presentation that'll make your head spin.
Maybe I have time for one more question.
Okay, one more. There you go.
So the old growth forest, I'm curious about the time frame. I think a lot of the forests around here are 100 to 200 years old. What kind of a time frame is considered old growth where it stops
Accumulating carbon.
carbon?
It depends on the climate and where you are in the trees. So I don't think I could say for here what that would be, but 100 would not be considered old growth.
Okay.
Yeah. And part of it too, the disturbance, like the disturbance itself of logging causes a carbon loss. So.
Soil compaction.
Yeah.
So they're still accumulating so these forests.
Oh, I would say yes, these forests are absolutely accumulating carbon. And that's one of the reasons why we're not seeing the full effect of our emissions. Yeah.
So then logging should be
I'm not going to say anything about logging.
regulated?
It's not my field.
And on that, I have two quick thoughts. I'm sure Dr. Caitlin Hicks-Priest will stick around afterwards and answer any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask. But if you're interested in the science fiction of ancient viruses coming to life, I'd encourage you to check out the Amazon original series Fortitude. During a couple of late nights of field season last year, I really enjoyed that series. And secondly, I'm sure Dr. Hicks-Priest is looking for volunteers to dig 2-meter deep soil pits. Solid Please approach her afterwards with your muscle pouch. Thank you, Dr. Hicks-Priest.